In this video, we're going to cover working with constraints in the XCode environment. So I'm looking at a scene here. I've got a view controller, and we're going to keep it fairly simple just to kind of make the point here. So we've got a username field, a label, a password with a label, and then a login button. And so what I've done first is I've removed all constraints from this control. And I'm going to run it real quick to kind of show what it does. And so basically what happens if you don't have any constraints, it's a random act. In fact, I've seen much worse than this. In one application I had, I've removed the constraints and the login button actually showed up here at the top. So the point is without any constraints on the control, when you go to display it inside of the app, inside of the phone or the iPad or whatever it happens to be getting displayed in, it could do all kinds of crazy stuff. And so it brings up this aspect to the programming that's a little strange, is that I'm positioning this here on the screen, but I'm basically positioning it within a square box, and I don't really know where it's going to get displayed on the device itself, because they all have different width screens, different heights, and so forth. So in order to get it to display where I want it to look exactly the way I have it here on the screen, I need to add constraints. And so to do that, we're going to go down here and we're going to tell it to reset, and we'll do it. And note here we have selected view, and then we've got all views in the login control. Each one of these elements they consider a view, which is a little strange, but that's the way it is. So the top section is only working with a specific element, and the bottom section is working with the whole control. Well, I'm going to tell it to reset to suggested constraints. And so what has happened now, if we click on any of these fields, you can see a list of all the constraints that it has applied. Now, a few of them that are important are the height and width. You actually have to have a height and width constraint for the system to maintain the height of this button, as an example. So without those constraints, when you go to display it on the phone, it'll actually resize it to whatever it feels like it wants to resize it to, and you'll end up with things not going the way you wanted. So to make sure that you have the height and width of everything, you literally have to set those, and I'm going to show you how to do that in just a second. But first I want to run this on the device so that you can see what has happened. Now this is the way that Apple has decided that, or Xcode has decided that it thinks the constraints need to be applied. As you can see, it's completely worthless. It didn't, I won't say completely worthless, but pretty close. It did not maintain the height and width of anything on the control or on the page. It did not maintain the relationship between the label and the text fields that they were associated with. It's basically just randomly applied some constraints that it thought you might want, but in reality, it really didn't help you out much. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to have to fix all of this stuff. So we do have a height and a width applied to this particular field, and it also has a constraint that applies to the top of the view element. So this particular field here on its own is not badly positioned. It's centered in the control and has a vertical element. So I'm going to leave that particular control alone for a minute, and let's take a look at this username variable. And one interesting thing here is that it chose to position this off of the left side. And over here on the right, we have our size inspector selected, and you can see the different constraints that it has applied. And then down here, you can actually see verbally what the constraints are. And if you point to them, it'll actually highlight the constraint over on the left, so you can see what each one of them is actually going to. But this leading space here doesn't make a lot of sense. So I'm going to click on it, and we're going to hit the delete button to get rid of it. And so then we'll hit the username again, and now you can see that it's actually colored itself red. It now thinks that it has an issue. Another interesting constraint that it added is that it actually looks like it has constrained this particular element. It has constrained it to this bottom text field. So instead of constraining it to the text field it's closest to, it has actually constrained it to the bottom one. That's another constraint that I really don't want to have, so I'm going to delete it. And so now all I have is a height and width. I don't have any other positioning constraints. And so I want to constrain this thing to this top field. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit the control key and we're going to click and drag until it highlights the top. So we clicked in the bottom in the main thing we're trying to position, and then we drag it up to the one that we want to position it with. And I want to have vertical spacing to that field. It's a little confusing, and one thing that you really need to pay attention to is this is a hand icon that is coming up, and many times I have gone down here to pick something and you can see I'm putting the fingers on equal width, but it actually has highlighted the one below it. It's very misleading, so you really have to pay attention, put the palm of the hand in on the icon, and this is really crazy that we're even talking about this, but for whatever reason they chose a hand on this thing. And so now I have positioned this thing relative to this top field. Now the other problem that we have is we want the leading edge of this thing to be positioned equal to this field that it's associated with. And so again, I'm going to control click on that. I'm going to click up to that other field and I'm going to tell it that I want to go leading. So this is aligning the leading edges of those two controls. Now it's not aligning them exactly. You'll notice that this thing actually has a +5 here because I have this field or this text field or the label a little bit to the right to cause it to line up with the actual text that shows up in this text field. So it's not perfectly aligned. You'll also notice that when I click on this guy, everything is blue except for this constraint here, and if I click on this guy, it's yellow. I've got two blue constraints here, but I've got a yellow constraint or an orange constraint, which is telling me that I'm missing something. There's some element here that is missing. Now the first thing I want to do is I'm going to come down here and I'm going to tell it to update the constraints for this particular field. I just want to make sure that everything that is here is up to date. You really wouldn't think that I would have had to do that because I haven't moved anything. But here is a good example. I'm going to click on this text field and I'm going to move it 1 pixel to the right, and you'll notice that now it's turned yellow down here at the bottom. So as I'm moving this element around, it actually causes the system to change the constraints, but it doesn't update them all the time. And so from time to time you'll have to come down here to the little triangle and tell it to reset or update the constraints. Now I put it back in the same position so I don't have to do it now, but the point is if you end up moving any of these fields around on the control, you'll need to go back and update them. Now the next problem we have is this element has a height and width, but it has constrained itself to no vertical element. So I need to actually tell it that I want it, so I'm going to control click and I'm going to tell it that I want it to align itself vertically with this guy, or I can do vertically with the username field. Either one of them will be fine. So we're going to tell it vertical spacing, and notice that it didn't actually do anything here. When I click on it, I still do not have the vertical space, and I don't know why it does this. I'm going to tell it to update the constraints again, and it still didn't fix it. So again, I'm going to control click and I'm going to appear vertical, and still nothing there. And I have no idea other than this is just buggy as crap to work with. This is probably one of my least favorite things to deal with Xcode, is trying to get these fields. I'm still totally baffled as to what is going on here. We want vertical spacing. There we go. Now, you'll notice that I did exactly the same thing 4 times before this thing actually added that constraint. And again, I have no earthly idea why it does that. The next thing that we're going to have a problem with is our password. Again, it has aligned itself to the left side for some reason instead of the above field. So I'm going to click and get rid of that. You'll also notice that it has added a constraint between itself and the button vertically. That does okay for the button, but it's not going to do okay for the actual field. So we're going to get rid of that constraint. And now I'm going to control click and I'm going to tell it to align itself vertically to that field. And then I want to align itself to leading on that part of it. And then again, it's orange for whatever reason. I'm going to come down here and tell it to update constraints. And now the password field appears to be good. So everything is blue. I don't have any red. I don't have any orange, which are telling me that I'm missing something. Now we're going to click on the login button. And again, imagine that this thing is actually, it has centered itself, which is good, but it has aligned itself to the bottom of the screen, which means that if I get a longer device, a device with a longer screen, the button's actually going to move relative to the bottom of the screen, not relative to these other fields that I have up here. So I don't want this constraint. So what we'd rather have is we would rather have this button align itself vertically to this field or to the password field. And again, sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. You just have to keep sitting here and doing this until eventually it gets what you want. And I do not know what causes this. So I'm going to come back down here and tell it to update the constraints again just to see. And one interesting thing here is I've got a center constraint, and then I've also got, there's another line here. So if we look over here to the right, we have the width equals, we have, it's aligned itself to the X of the username, and it's aligned itself to the center of the password, which I don't even know. So I'm going to delete these constraints because, so this constraint is even not right. Okay, so we're just going to start over. We're going to control click, and I'm going to tell it to align itself vertically to that field. And good Lord, I want to tell it to align itself to the horizontal in the container, center horizontally in the container. So that will get me position left and right. And I'm still, this is going to drive me crazy. You can understand why I love Apple so much. Vertical spacing. I can't get the button. And I would love if somebody can tell me what I'm doing wrong here. I'd love to know what it is, because I don't even know why I'm having to do this in the first place. It ought to be smart enough to position this appropriately. So let's just run this for a second and see what we look like so far. Wow. So even now we don't have, the password field is not aligning itself to center. The login button looks okay, but it's not going to be okay when we run it on a different device because there's no constraint for that vertical placement. But first, so this guy has lost its center. So I'm just going to control click on it and drag it back up here and tell it to center horizontally in the container again. So that now has its center, but now it's yellow. I still can't get the vertical there. Oh, and now it's turned itself blue, so it must have just taken it a second to get itself going. But I just don't get this. And there you go. So 43 times of clicking and dragging, and it finally has decided that it's going to add that constraint. It is a lovely world we live in. So I'm going to run it now. And now we have everything positioned the way we want it and constrained properly. So have fun in the world of Xcode and constraints.